there's a lot of things that can be said about this, but there's 3 or 4 points that I'd like to make. The first is that there's, in my opinion, a false distinction that's being made by apologists of Sharia law between Islam and Sharia law on the one hand versus the abominations and realities, the harsh realities of Sharia law on the other, that's practiced by either Islamic states like Iran or Saudi Arabia, as well as Sharia courts here in Britain. The other issue that I want to raise is that irrespective of people's beliefs, when it comes to Islam and Sharia law as a personal matter, when you're dealing with Islamic states and courts and so on, it's really a matter of political power and not a matter of personal belief, as is often portrayed. And finally, on the issue of why criticism of Islam as a belief system, Sharia law or Islamism are not racism and that Islamophobia is actually, in my opinion, a bogus term that's used to silence criticism. Now, let me just start with the first point. And the thing is that we're often told by apologists that Sharia courts and Islamic states don't really practice the real Sharia and the real Islam. And this is, what's interesting is they always say that when they're challenging us, we never hear them on the streets opposing stonings and amputations and Sharia courts in Britain. It's always with regards us, which I find quite interesting in and of itself. I think partly this is because Sharia law has committed such abominations across the world that even many believers don't want to associate themselves with it. And this makes perfect sense in the same way that you can be a Catholic and not necessarily agree with anything the Pope says. So in that sense, I think, especially if you look upon religion and being a Muslim, for example, as a personal matter, then it becomes very clear that, you don't necessarily subscribe to a lot of the things that Islamists do or that Sharia law proposes. But Islamists themselves, actually, this is what's interesting. Islamists themselves will often distance themselves from what's happening in Islamic states and in Sharia courts in Britain. And that's, I think, the interesting point. In my opinion, that's really a public relations ploy and an attempt to dupe the public into believing that Sharia law is something that it isn't. And I want to give you an example. Just recently, there was the hate preacher, Al-Haddad. He was supposed to speak at the LSE at the invitation of the Islamic Society here. And if you look at the introduction, I just want to give you this as an example of the ploys that they use. And I want to use this talk to focus on these sorts of things which don't really get mentioned enough when we're discussing Sharia law in general and its violations of rights and so on. Now, the Islamic Society introduced Al-Haddad's talk in this way. It says, all aspects of a Muslim's life are governed by Sharia. Sharia law comes from a combination of sources, including the Quran, the Holy Book, the Hadith, sayings and conducts of the Prophet Muhammad, and fatwas, rulings of Islamic scholars. And it goes on to say in its press release and publicity around Haddad's speaking engagement here, that many people, including Muslims, misunderstand Sharia. It's often associated with amputation of limbs, death by stoning, lashes, and other medieval punishments. Because of this, it's sometimes thought of as draconian. Many Muslims, however, hold a different view. In the Islamic tradition, Sharia is seen as something that nurtures humanity. They see the Sharia not in the light of something primitive, but as something divinely revealed. In a society where social problems are endemic, Sharia frees humanity to realize its individual potential. Now, these are things that we often hear by apologists of Islam and Sharia law and Islamism. And as I mentioned, it's a public relations ploy, because if you look at what Haddad actually says, and has said, he was going to come and talk about Sharia as a moral code. And they introduced him as an Islamic scholar. And as Richard Dawkins says, usually, to be a scholar, you do need to read more than one book. He's a jurist. He serves as a judge on the Islamic Sharia councils. He studied Islamic sciences for over 20 years under the tutelage of renowned scholars such as the late Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, as well as the retired head of the kingdom's higher judicial council. It sounds very good. He specializes in many of the Islamic sciences and submitted his doctoral thesis on Islamic jurisprudence concerning Muslim minorities. Sheikh Haytham is highly respected, having specialized knowledge in the Islamic sciences. He provides complex theories, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry, I can't read any more of this. But anyway, you get the idea. But these are some of the things that Al-Haddad has said. Okay? And I want you to remember the publicity of the Islamic Society about this man. He says, a man should not be questioned why he hit his wife, because this is something between them. Leave them alone. They can sort out their matters amongst themselves. Even the father of the daughter who is married to the man, he should not ask his daughter why you have been beaten or hit by your husband. He goes on to say on peaceful coexistence with other groups and religions and so on. This peaceful coexistence is wrong. Peaceful coexistence and enjoying the good and forbidding the evil. Peaceful coexistence should be spread by the dawah, which is the proselytization of non-Muslims. And then on female genital mutilation, for example, he says, I haven't come across any scholar who says it clearly that it's not sunnah. All of them, they say that it is, and in fact some scholars say that it's wajib, which is obligatory. On the killing of apostates, he said, who are the innocents? Capital punishment in Islamic law is permissible for those designated as, quote, innocent, according to international law, such as the one who leaves his religion, just as the married adulterer is a criminal eligible for the death penalty, according to the Islamic legal principles of consensus. And so on and so forth, justifications on suicide bombings and what have you. The same man, Al-Haddad, said about Jews, they're enemies of God and the descendants of apes and pigs, and so on and so forth. So what I want to say is that there's a huge level of deception going on by a lot of Islamic societies that feign to be religious groups and religious societies for Muslims, when in fact they are societies that are there to promote Islamism and Sharia law. And if you look at the publicity around the way they introduced Al-Haddad and actually the types of things that he said, you can see very clearly that it is a form of deception that's taking place. It's a play on words. And it's interesting, if you look at a lot of the atheist societies that have had problems with complaints about the Jesus and Mo cartoon, for example, LSE, Queen Mary, UCL, they've got very strong Islamic societies there that are linked with Islamism as well. So there are links to this. It's not things that are just happening out of the blue. And it's not, in my opinion, you know, the outrage of a Muslim minority. In fact, Muslims, or those labeled as such, are very often the first victims of Sharia law. This is a ploy and attempts by Islamism. And it's not one and the same with Muslims demanding this. The other point I want to raise is the fact that there's also a lot of deception around the issue of Islam. You know, I debated at UCL in December some members of the Ahmadiyya community. Now, the Ahmadiyyas themselves are considered heretics by lots of people, including a lot of Islamists and some Muslims. And interestingly enough, they were opposed to the Jesus and Mo cartoon at UCL. They argued for, the principle of not being offended, and said that it's a principle, we shouldn't be offending people. But they themselves held a exhibition in Kirklees of the Quran. They wanted to have an exhibition of the Quran. And as a result of violence against them, because the Muslim organization there said that they're not real Muslims, their exhibition had to be canceled. So the whole question of offense is another huge issue. But I debated them, and they are a persecuted minority in many states which has Islamic law. But they were their speaker was arguing against our campaign for Sharia, against Sharia law, and said basically that this is not really Sharia law and this is not Islam, and that we can't blame Islam for the acts of Islamic states and for Sharia courts, for example, in Britain or in Iran or Saudi Arabia that perpetrate misogyny and inequality and so on and so forth. And there's the deception that happens here is that you often see, for example, on the issue of stoning, and I'm going to just give you a few examples on this. We're told that stoning is not in the Quran, and therefore it's a lie to say that stoning is part of Sharia law and part of the rules and regulations of Islamic states. And one of the reasons they give is because you won't find stoning in the Quran. That's true. But there is a hadith on stoning, which is also part of Sharia law. And I think this is one of the things about the ploys that they use in order to dupe people into believing that it's not really Islamic law, but whereas in fact it is. Now, when I raised this issue at this debate with the Ahmadiyya speaker, I asked him, he said it's a lie to say that stoning is part and parcel of Sharia law. I asked him, is there not a hadith on stoning? He said, no, there wasn't. And later on, interestingly, he made a comment on a blog about why he had said that. And he said, his name is Ayaz Mahmoud, he's another Islamic scholar. He said that had Maryam asked me, because I had asked whether there was a hadith on stoning, he said no. On this blog, he said, had Maryam asked me, has the Holy Prophet ever ordered that a man be stoned to death? To this, I would have had to answer yes, and then hope and pray that the moderator would give me a minute or two to explain the whole background of the specific hadith. But of course, at the time, the opportunity did not afford itself to give the entire explanation, so I gave her the direct answer to her question, which is a big no, only to silence her because I didn't want to get into this whole issue during the debate. So this is just another example of how these issues are clouded with lies and half-truths. Yes, it's true to say stoning is not in the Quran, but it is also in the Hadith, and Sharia law is a compilation of all of them. Another example I want to give you, and then I'm just going to move on, because I'm just trying to bring up some issues for thought and also for discussion, is that saying that we always hear, and I know you've all heard it a million times, about how Islam says whoever killed a human being shall be looked upon as though he has killed all mankind. Have you heard this quote? Yes. Well, the full quote is, that was why we laid it down for the Israelites that whoever killed a human being, except as a punishment for murder or other villainy in the land, shall be looked upon as though he has killed all mankind, and that whoever saved a human life shall be regarded as though he has saved all mankind. Our apostles brought them veritable proofs, yet it was not long before many of them committed great evils in the land. Those that make war against God and his apostle and spread disorder shall be put to death or crucified or have their hands and feet cut off on alternate sides or be banished from the country. So it's a very different thing than the one line that we always hear. So I suppose why I'm raising this is because I find that oftentimes this debate on Sharia law, on Islamic states, on Islamism, is clouded by misinformation coming from Islamists and apologists, from the postmodernist left to, a lot of ministers in government and so on and so forth. And I guess one of the points I want to bring up is the fact that we don't necessarily have to take everything they say at face value. We don't take Bush at face value when he says he invaded Iraq for women's rights. We know it's a lie. And what I'm proposing is that what Islamists say a lot of times is just blatant lies in order to carry on with their business as usual, which is nothing else but homophobia and misogyny and inhumanity. And which brings me to the last point, and I don't want to speak for much longer, so Sundas can speak and we have more time for debate, because that's where it gets interesting, is this issue of Islamophobia. Now, and many other issues. Now, LSESU Atheist Society has been involved in this issue as a result of complaints regarding the Jesus and Mo cartoon. And there's been all this talk about how there's a need to show respect, not to offend, and so on and so forth. And I guess what I have to say is that a lot of what Islamists say offend me. A lot of what Islam and the Bible and the Quran and the Torah say also offends me. But that's life, get over it. The point of having free expression is that we are able to also offend and to take offense, but that the right to speak is hugely important. It may not seem so important to a university student, though I think it's becoming more clear why it is very important. But it is important for a lot of people, particularly for those who are surviving and languishing under and suffering under Islamism across the world. Now, on 14th of March, we have called for an international day to defend apostates and blasphemers across the world. And they include Muslims. Many of them are Muslims. A 17-year-old boy who, in his exam paper, wrote something about Muhammad and is now in prison because of it. Hamza Kashgari, a Muslim, who tweeted about a conversation about Muhammad, how he loves him, but also hates some of his characteristics, and how women in Saudi Arabia can't go to hell twice because they're already in hell as it is. He faces the death penalty because of what he's tweeted. And there are many other cases, but these are cases of people who are Muslims themselves. And so what I want to say is this whole idea of Islamophobia and offense are again bogus accusations in order to restrict criticism which is desperately needed. And so I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot to say about Sharia law, its practice in Britain, which I think is a human rights scandal of gigantic proportions. I find it, upsetting and atrocious that there are thousands upon thousands of women and children in this country, citizens of Britain, that are treated in the same way that they are treated in Iran under Sharia law. It's the same rules that apply to them. And the fact that there is no more, citizenship rights don't apply, equality doesn't apply, nothing applies but religious laws as a result of a multicultural policy that divides and ghettoizes people and puts religions and beliefs above real live human beings and their rights and freedoms. So I'm going to end there. I'll let Sundas carry on, and then hopefully we'll have a discussion on some of the issues that I've raised. Thank you.